The biting chill of late November 1991 had already settled over Hartford, Connecticut, a prelude to the long New England winter. Leafless elms stood stark against the gray skies, and the brick buildings of the West End seemed to huddle closer, seeking warmth. This was the world of Sarah Jenkins, a world she navigated with a quiet grace and an unwavering sense of purpose. At 36, Sarah wasn't flashy. She taught English literature at Hartford Public High School, a job she cherished with an almost monastic devotion. Her days were a predictable rhythm. Up before dawn, a quick breakfast of toast and coffee in her cozy apartment on Kenyon Street, then a short drive in her sturdy, if somewhat faded, 1986 Ford Taurus to the bustling school. Sarah was the kind of teacher students remembered, not for her flamboyant personality, she had none, but for her piercing blue eyes that saw beyond the surface, her patient encouragement, and her ability to make Shakespeare resonate with teenagers who'd rather be listening to Nirvana. She wore practical skirts and cardigans, her auburn hair often pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, but her voice, when she read poetry, could transport a classroom. She lived alone, having never married, but her life was full. She volunteered at the local library, walked the trails of Elizabeth Park every Sunday, and exchanged weekly calls with her older sister, Eleanor, who lived in Glastonbury. To all who knew her, Sarah was a pillar of consistency, a quiet fixture in the vibrant, sometimes volatile, tapestry of Hartford. But in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, a subtle discord had begun to hum beneath the surface of Sarah's placid life. It wasn't something she spoke about directly, not even to Eleanor. It was a creeping unease, an almost imperceptible shift in her usually composed demeanor. Colleagues noticed her staring off into space more often in the staff lounge, a slight tension in her jaw. Her close friend Martha, who taught history down the hall, once saw Sarah jump at the unexpected clang of a locker door, a reaction entirely out of character for the unflappable Miss Jenkins. Sarah brushed it off, blaming stress from grading papers, but Martha harbored a quiet suspicion that something else was at play. The first tangible sign of trouble, in retrospect, was the series of anonymous notes. They weren't overtly threatening, at least not at first. Clippings of poems, snippets of literary prose, always about intense love or obsession, left on her desk or tucked into her mailbox at school. Sarah initially dismissed them as a student's clumsy attempt at admiration, perhaps a misguided crush. But as they continued, growing more frequent and a touch more personal, referencing details only someone who observed her closely would know, like the specific kind of tea she drank or the book she was currently reading on her lunch break, a chill began to seep into her bones. She started locking her classroom door even when she was just stepping out for a moment. She walked a little faster to her car in the darkening afternoons. She began to check her rearview mirror more often. Then came Monday, November 25th, 1991. Sarah Jenkins didn't show up for her first period English class. Her absence was immediately noted. Sarah was never late, never absent without meticulously arranged cover. The school secretary tried her apartment phone, no answer. Martha, increasingly worried, called Eleanor, who hadn't heard from her sister since their usual Sunday call. By mid-morning, the Hartford Police Department was alerted. Detective Ray Miller, a seasoned officer with 2 decades on the force, drew the case. His gut clenched, as it always did when an adult simply vanished without a trace, especially one with such a stable routine. The initial investigation moved with the methodical, unhurried pace of 1991 police work. Uniformed officers were dispatched to Sarah's Kenyon Street apartment. The door was locked, no signs of forced entry. Inside, everything was orderly, untouched. Her bed was made, her breakfast dishes washed and put away. Her purse, with her wallet and keys, sat on the kitchen counter. Her car, the Ford Taurus, was still parked in its usual spot on the street. It was as if she had simply stepped out for a moment and dissolved into thin air. The only thing missing was Sarah herself and her school bag, a worn leather satchel she carried religiously, filled with student papers and her own well-loved copy of Wuthering Heights. The neighborhood canvass began. Officers knocked on every door, showing Sarah's photograph. Most neighbors knew her by sight, a friendly nod, a polite wave. No one had seen anything unusual on Sunday evening or Monday morning. The paperboy remembered seeing her car on Monday morning, but not Sarah. The garbage truck driver making his rounds hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. It was a blank slate, an unnerving void. Ray Miller and his team pored over Sarah's life. Her bank accounts were untouched. No recent significant withdrawals, no large transfers. Her phone records showed calls to Eleanor, Martha, and a few local numbers, grocery stores, the library. Nothing suspicious. They interviewed her colleagues, her friends, her students. Everyone spoke of her dedication, her kindness, her quiet nature. One student, Mark Thorne, an intense, bright but socially awkward senior, stood out marginally. He was a gifted writer, often producing exceptional work in Sarah's class, but he had also shown a peculiar attachment to her. Martha mentioned that Thorne would sometimes linger after class, asking unusual questions about Sarah's personal opinions on poetry, pushing boundaries in a way that felt slightly off. Sarah, ever professional, had always handled him with grace, though Martha had noticed Sarah sometimes seemed a little relieved when he finally left. When questioned, Thorne seemed genuinely distressed by Sarah's disappearance, offering a slightly too detailed account of his own Monday morning routine. He was dismissed as a distressed student, his grief mirroring that of many others. There was nothing concrete to hold him on. Flyers with Sarah's face, a smiling, slightly blurred photo from a school yearbook, appeared on lampposts and storefronts across Hartford. Local news channels ran stories, anchors solemn, urging anyone with information to come forward. Alina and Martha made emotional pleas. The community rallied, forming search parties that combed Elizabeth Park and the wooded areas along the Connecticut River. But days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The leads dwindled. The initial frenzy gave way to a dull ache of despair. The police, with no evidence of foul play, no body, no ransom demand, were stumped. Sarah Jenkins simply ceased to exist. Alina Jenkins became a ghost of her former self. Every ringing phone, every strange car passing her street, brought a fresh wave of hope and subsequent disappointment. The absence of closure was a torment, an open wound that refused to heal. She kept Sarah's apartment exactly as it was, a silent shrine, a testament to a life paused, not ended. The Hartford Police Department, despite Detective Miller's persistent efforts, eventually classified Sarah's case as a cold missing persons file. The investigation didn't stop, but the active pursuit slowed to a crawl, relegated to file reviews and occasional re-interviews, a quiet hum in the background of active cases. The city moved on, or tried to. Sarah Jenkins became another tragic local legend, whispered about in hushed tones, a reminder of the fragility of life and the darkness that could swallow someone whole in broad daylight. Life, in its relentless march, continued. The 1990s gave way to the new millennium. Technology advanced, new forensic techniques emerged, but Sarah's case remained stubbornly, chillingly cold. Detective Miller retired in 2000, haunted by the unsolved mystery, passing on his notes and the weight of the case to a new generation of detectives. Then, 11 years after Sarah Jenkins vanished, in the spring of 2002, something indeed surfaced. The call came into the Hartford Police Department on a Tuesday morning in April. It wasn't from Hartford itself, but from East Hartford, just across the river. A construction crew renovating an old, dilapidated house on Main Street, a property that had stood empty for years after its reclusive elderly owner, Harold Finch, passed away, had made a bizarre discovery. During demolition work in the attic, beneath layers of insulation and dusty floorboards, they uncovered a small, crude wooden box sealed shut with rusted nails. Inside the box, nestled amongst brittle newspaper clippings from the late 1980s, were several items that sent a jolt of ice through the new cold case detective, Lisa Chen, who responded to the scene. There was a worn leather school satchel, the same kind Sarah Jenkins was known to carry. Inside it, among some loose student papers, was a hardcover copy of Wuthering Heights, its pages underlined and annotated in Sarah's distinctive, elegant hand. Most chillingly, there was Sarah's driver's license, her smiling face staring out from the laminated plastic, and a small, silver locket she always wore, containing tiny, faded photographs of her parents. But the most critical item was a folded, slightly yellowed piece of paper. It was a letter, handwritten, addressed simply to Martha. Detective Chen handled it with gloved hands, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The letter was dated November 23, 1991, just 2 days before Sarah disappeared. The contents of the letter were a chilling, belated cry for help. "Dearest Martha, I know this sounds insane, but I needed to write it down to put it somewhere safe. I've been feeling increasingly uneasy about Mark Thorne. His attention, which I once dismissed as youthful infatuation, has taken a decidedly darker turn. He's been leaving these cryptic notes, poems that speak of a possessive love, and his presence has become almost suffocating. He knows things, small details about my life, my routines, that he shouldn't. He showed up outside my apartment building twice last week, just sitting in his car. When I confronted him, he merely smiled, a strange, knowing look in his eyes, and claimed he was just passing by. I tried to be firm to set boundaries, but it feels like talking to a brick wall. He's brilliant, yes, but there's an intensity to him that frightens me. I told him he needed to focus on his studies and give me space, but he just sees it as a challenge. I don't want to cause a scene or hurt his academic future, but I'm genuinely scared, Martha. I feel like I'm being watched. I think I need to report this to Principal Davison, but I keep hesitating, hoping it will just go away. I just wish I knew what to do. If anything happens, please know this isn't just a sudden vanishing. Something feels very wrong. Love, Sarah. The letter hit the Hartford Police Department like a seismic shockwave. 11 years. 11 agonizing years of silence, and now, a direct, undeniable lead. Detective Chen immediately pulled up the old case files. Mark Thorne. His name was there, mentioned in passing during the initial interviews, dismissed as a student expressing grief. The initial investigation had focused heavily on a potential random abduction, a car accident, or an unplanned departure, anything but a premeditated act stemming from an escalating, obsessive student. The technology and methodologies of 1991 simply hadn't been equipped to connect those subtle dots. Or perhaps the psychological profile of such a threat wasn't as widely understood or prioritized. A nationwide alert was issued for Mark Thorne. By 2002, he would be 29 years old. It took less than 48 hours to locate him. He was living in suburban Massachusetts, working as a software engineer, leading a seemingly unremarkable life. He was married with 2 young children. When the detectives arrived at his doorstep, Thorne showed a flicker of the same unsettling calm Sarah had described in her letter. He denied everything, claiming no knowledge of Sarah's disappearance, feigning shock at the news. But when confronted with the letter, with the irrefutable evidence of Sarah's locket and driver's license found in the East Hartford house, his composure began to crack. The interrogation lasted for hours. Eventually, under relentless questioning, the facade crumbled. Mark Thorne confessed. He admitted to being obsessed with Sarah. He saw her as his muse, his intellectual equal, his destiny. He believed they were meant to be together, and her rejections, her attempts to distance herself, were simply tests of his devotion. He'd followed her for weeks, watching her routines. On the evening of November 24, 1991, the Sunday before she vanished, he had been waiting outside her apartment building on Kenyon Street. When she returned from her Sunday walk, he approached her, pleading, demanding her attention. He showed her a new poem he'd written, a dark, unsettling piece. When she tried to gently but firmly dismiss him and threatened to report his behavior, something in him snapped. He lunged at her, pulling her into her apartment. There was a brief struggle, quiet, desperate. He strangled her, his hands around her throat, cutting off her life as easily as she had, in his twisted mind, cut off his access to her. The silence afterward was deafening. He then panicked, but with a chilling, calculated precision. He wrapped her body in a shower curtain, carried her out the back door in the dead of night, and placed her in the trunk of his own car, a beat-up Ford Escort. He then drove to the dilapidated house in East Hartford, owned by his eccentric great-uncle Harold Finch, who was rarely there and suffered from early-stage dementia. He knew the house was mostly empty, a place no one would look. In the dusty attic, he buried Sarah's body beneath the floorboards, concealing it with insulation. He then hid her satchel, her locket, her license, and that damning letter, sealed in the crude wooden box, believing it would never be found. He had intended to retrieve the box later, but fear and the passage of time had kept him away from the old house. His great-uncle's death and the subsequent renovation were a confluence of events he could never have predicted. The revelation brought a torrent of grief, but also a profound, harrowing sense of resolution for Alina. Sarah's remains were recovered from the East Hartford attic, a skeletonized testament to a life brutally cut short. The funeral, 11 years delayed, was a somber affair, attended by former colleagues, students, and a generation of police officers who had never forgotten her face. Mark Thorne was tried and convicted of Sarah Jenkins' murder. The letter, Sarah's own words, served as the most powerful evidence, a voice from beyond the grave. The case, once a chilling footnote in Hartford's unsolved mysteries, became a stark reminder of the hidden dangers that can lurk in plain sight, the profound impact of obsession, and the enduring pain of a lost life. And of how sometimes even the most deeply buried secrets can eventually, tragically, surface. Character count, 21,570.